Welcome to Red Star, a new show about the revolutions and counter-revolutions that have shaped our world. Red Star is co-hosted by Amar Alijan, Taimur Rahman, and Ziad Faisal. Amar is a historian. He is the general secretary of the Hakuk Akhlaq Party, the HKP, and he sits on the Council of the Progressive International. Taimur is an economist who also serves as the general secretary of the Mazdur Kisan Party, and Ziad is a writer, a researcher in political economy, and a member of the HKP. Red Star will bring you interviews and discussions that seek to reclaim the great revolutionary traditions of the past, to build a materialist understanding of the present, and to contribute in our small way to the construction of a global anti-imperialist and communist agenda that sheds the dead weight of defeat and disorientation which continue to hold back so many within our ranks. It is time to move away from what Domenico Losurdo has brilliantly described as the self-flagellation of the vanquished, that tendency of many on the left to punish ourselves for our own defeats. We have the world in our hands, and we stand on the shoulders of giants. Welcome to Red Star. We are recording this inaugural episode on the anniversary of Al-Aqsa flood, Hamas's military operation on the 7th of October 2023, which finally broke open the gates of Gaza and set in motion events that could well lead to the end of the Zionist project. Here to discuss the significance of that operation and the broader Palestinian struggle is Max Ajl, author of A People's Green New Deal, associate editor of the Agrarian South Journal, a member of the editorial board of Middle East Critique, a member of the Anti-Imperiallist Scholars Collective, and a long-time anti-Zionist activist. Max, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to begin, before we turn to Palestine and the 7th of October specifically, I want to start with a broader question about the relationship of movements, of rebellions, of anti-systemic movements, and of revolutions in the global south with political forces in the global north. Karl Marx famously said that a nation that enslaves another forges its own chains. He was addressing the International Working Man's Association, the First International, and referring specifically to the English colonization of Ireland. He said that the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of the English working class's own social emancipation. And this is an idea that would be carried through the 20th century and the broader history of revolutions and internationalism. Decades later, almost a century later, Lenin expressed a very similar sentiment, observing that Europe was increasingly backwards, increasingly controlled by these deeply reactionary powers that drew a lot of their power, a lot of their wealth from the plunder of the colonial world. And in contrast to that, he saw this dynamism, this powerful democratic movement, hundreds of millions of people strong, mobilizing for liberation across Asia. And he said that no force on earth can prevent the victory of this movement, which will liberate both the peoples of Europe and the peoples of Asia. So the question I want to begin with is about the political geography of struggles for orientation. Is it necessary to defeat imperialism in the periphery before a revolution of some kind is possible in the imperial core? And what does that mean for the orientation of political forces in the global north today?
So to start with, I think we need to look at what is objective, what is subjective, and what is speculative or forward-looking in terms of your question and the overall process of accumulation that informs any understanding or any speculation about what political struggle could look like going forward. And so one thing to keep in mind is that there's a very objective question about whether under capitalism, people in the imperial core benefit from the exploitation of the periphery, right? Under capitalism, it's obviously beneficial for workers in the imperial core to be gaining a share of the proceeds of the exploitation of the third world versus not gaining a share of those proceeds. So in this sense, that by itself, without entering into whether or not they are net exploiters, whether they are net beneficiaries of value flows and so forth, it's obviously clear that under imperialism, right, and under capitalism, there is a large portion of the core working class which receives a share of the benefits from the process of imperialist exploitation. This is just an objective truth. Now, there's a more speculative question. Under worlds where the means of production, the ownership of the means of production is socialized and democratically managed, can standard of living at some, in a qualitative sense, be reach a very high level in the imperial core, while also rising to reach that level in the periphery? I think it's possible, yes. Although there are certain forms of obviously overconsumption that would have to be stopped, right? So in between those two, you have in between this kind of vision of a shared developmental convergence and ecological prosperity and so forth, and the current situation where a lot of the core working class, just like the Israeli working class, right, is actively participating in offering its political support to the process of exploitation of the periphery. I mean, that is the strategy they've chosen, and not just the working class, right? I actually think the intelligentsia is actually far more complicit at this level than the working class. I mean, you have literally thousands of Marxist intelligentsia who now they find it fashionable to pontificate about internationalism and so forth, but cannot mention a single war, a single sanctions campaign that the U.S. is prosecuting, involving the destruction of entire societies other than Palestine, which in fact functions therefore as a fig leaf for their own, in fact, objective benefiting from their own kind of social position as intellectual mercenaries for imperialism, right? And this is people who are considered highly respected Northern social democratic intellectuals, like Theo Francos, for example, who has actually been involved in progressive international projects, right? This is actually someone who actually has covered up imperialist coup d'etat in Bolivia, right? And I'll just take her as an example, right? And actually benefits from that. So I think it's more important to actually fixate on the intelligentsia and the labor unions, of course. For example, that the ILA, I think right now is carrying out the loading of military cargo, including weapons that are actually bound for the Zionist state, right? So you have a set of institutions that are meant to actually manage the process of breaking from this kind of, manage the process and prevent any sort of breaking from the overall consent of core working classes bourgeoisie to imperialist hegemony, right? Given that this is the state of things, right? Given that this is the state of things, it is unreasonable. It is simply not rational to expect that the breaks in the system are going to come in the core, right? It's not rational because you've had important ruptures, and Palestine can lead to a rupture, or it can lead to a kind of reincorporation, depending on how Palestine is theorized. Is Palestine theorized as part of an Arab national question, as the symbol of the peripheral being subjugated by the core, or is Palestine kind of this kind of opaque, foggy symbol of global racism, but that's the only racism that's ever actually named, right? or is it kind of cast as some antediluvian remnant, or is it finally of colonialism as opposed to the ongoing crystallization of the fascist foreign policy that's embedded in the world system, right? All of these matter because they matter about the type of consciousness that's allowed to kind of effloresce in people's mind and then actually mean a rupture with the old way of seeing things. And it's okay to have a rupture with your old way of seeing things. We see it all the time. There's many people who used to be Zionists and are now firm line anti-Zionists or even resistance supporters. Welcome, right? You know, it's not like this is an exclusive club of people who are only woke and awake from the beginning. That is not the point at all. But the point is you have people who are deliberately looking away, and there's many of them, in fact. And they get very testy when you point it out, right? And this tells you very much that they know what they're doing, right? They're actually actively lying to manufacture consent for holocausts, right? Now, given that this is the state of things, right, it's very logical that the people who are much more oppressed are going to engage in a rebellion that is in the zone of storms, what Mao called the zone of storms. And this is a phrase Samir Amin picked up as well, and that this is what we can expect. And, objectively, given that these people are more oppressed, they have a more objective interest in escaping their oppression, right? I mean, there are orders of magnitude more oppressed, exploited, or simply subject to annihilation than people in the imperial core, right? Now, again, this doesn't make it inevitable in any sense, right? Because also existing under the boot of imperialism, but not being murdered because you don't resist, that's also a survival strategy. Right? This is something Abdul Jawad Omar pointed out, even in the case of Palestine, right? Not resisting is a survival strategy, and resisting is also a survival strategy. Both of them are survival strategies, right? Nevertheless, so it's not like the objective circumstance leads automatically to a subjective decision to revolt, and it does so mechanically. No, it has to be organized, right? And this is why, but nevertheless, we see the most kind of the brightest lightning bolts of struggle against the world system in the periphery, by nature of the fact that there's very little space to accommodate these people, right? The type of social democratic pacts that have been possible through a sharing of the proceeds of the imperial loot with some portion of the core working class, even though that social compact, that corporatist social compact has been steadily weakening since the 1970s, that is not really obtainable in the periphery of the world system, right? It can't happen for very objective reasons, in that because for example, that the peripheral bourgeoisie suffers in terms of deteriorating terms of trade and other kind of aspects of relative weakness with comparison to the core of the core bourgeoisie. They then are forced to super exploit their own working class, and this actually leaves objectively less space for a kind of social democratic social peace and so forth, right? Although it can still happen in certain ways, right? So all of this leads us to say that the ruptures in the world system have always come from the periphery of the world system, right? The revolutions in Western Europe failed, or were effectively contained, right, throughout the Euro-communist experience and so forth. I mean, even a lot of the European communist parties ended up being party to colonialism and struggled to break with colonialism. Even now, for example, the KKE is against Palestinian resistance. It's issued a ludicrous statement, right? You have a severe rupture of theory, which is actually not a mechanical reflection, but a kind of, let us say, a parametric expression or reflection of a class interest, right? And so this is why we see the hardest revolutions continuing to come from the periphery of the world system. And as a corollary of that, you see on the one hand, you see a portion of the core intelligentsia and the labor unions especially that are engaged in basically ignoring these revolts from the periphery. And then you see a younger group of people, and not just a younger group of people, who are actually understandably enthralled with this idea that there's people who want to live in dignity in a world with dignity for everybody, and allow that to carry them to a place of sympathy and solidarity with peripheralism.
Okay, so I want to turn now to Palestine specifically. You wrote a two-part essay called Palestine's Great Flood, where you situate the Zionist attack on Gaza and on Palestine more broadly, and the role of the axis of resistance in a world historical and a regional context. And in the first essay, you write that, and I quote, Palestine crystallizes nearly every contradiction within the current order. So the relevance of the Palestinian struggle, of the occupation, extends far beyond its borders. It reveals the fundamental character and brutality of Western imperialism. It reveals the impotence of international institutions. It reveals the role of the regional comprador elites in sustaining that project. And it emerges, as the Colombian president Gustavo Petro said, whom you also cite in the piece, as a warning to the entirety of the global South, a warning against resisting the diktats of the imperial order. So I want to unpack that notion with you here of Palestine as a fulcrum with truly global significance. Why is Palestine so central to our struggles?
Palestine is central for historical and structural reasons. I mean, first of all, if you look at the history of political repression in the United States, Palestine runs through it like a red thread, right? Going back to the 1970s and even earlier with the organization of Arab students, for example, that there was already in that period surveillance of Arab students, that a lot of the repressive legislation was the LA 8, I believe LA 7, was ran through campaigns to repress anti-Zionists and especially Palestinian activists in the United States. And as the flip side of that is that the Zionist institutions, like, for example, the Anti-Defamation League, have then played a central role in the domestic U.S. repressive apparatus, for example, spying on anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, to take one example, right? This is just speaking domestically. And also the Oslo process was central to the inauguration of the terror lists, which were signed into law in 1997, and bar material support, which are really actually meant to bar any sort of political sympathy for the remaining national liberation, pro-sovereign, or communist forces on a world scale, be it in the Philippines, FARC, PKK in Kurdistan, or the PFLP, and so forth, right? So in that sense, Palestine is very central because the U.S. by itself has made it central, right? The U.S. and the Zionist apparatuses in the U.S. themselves make Palestine very central, to the process of repression on a world scale. And furthermore, Palestine is kind of Israel has been central to the repressive apparatus of the United States and the European powers in terms of destroying the national liberation movements and the national independence movements and the Republican movements and the progressive movements in the Arab region, going back to the 1960s. And then accelerating in the 1970s, 1980s until today, where it's just used to hammer and create a state of sustained tension within this zone of geopolitical interest and geopolitical lightning storm within the world system, right? And then as this happens, right, this is talking about the repression. But then when you see the resistance against it, it forces people to take a position, right? Within the Arab state system itself, it's, are you going to support people who very simply have a rhetoric that's actually a centrist rhetoric of national sovereignty and independence, right? Who do not have a Cabral style or a Kanafani style rhetoric of national liberation in the sense of breaking the control of monopoly capital and anti-capitalism. No, and this is not I'm not making a judgment on them. I'm just making an analytical statement about what their actual, what the dominant rhetoric of Hamas, for example, looks like, right? They are just a classic nationalist anti-colonial movement, and yet they elicit the repression of Egypt, right? Egypt is fully complicit in the siege, has an army of hundreds of thousands. Jordan is fully complicit in the siege, right? The Lebanese ruling classes and the right are fully complicit in the normalization project, right? Meanwhile, the forces that are, with all of their sharp social contradictions domestically, the forces that are offering any level of material support to the or are part of the axis of resistance. That is, any forces that either are engaged in direct hostility or offering logistical support or ideological support are targeted for disruption by the United States and Israel. That this then becomes a very clear line of division. Either one, there are the neo-colonial pro-systemic forces that are fully allied, and then there are the forces with a rainbow of colorations for their domestic socioeconomic texture, but are pro-sovereign or in some senses are often go further and have a discourse closer to national developmentalism and sometimes even national liberation, with the left wing of Ansar Allah, for example. And these forces then are targeted systematically by the US, which creates a kind of, by its own dynamic, has created a regional war precisely if they refuse to compromise on their support stance. In the case of Hezbollah, Iraq announced, the militia today announced that they are entering a support stance. And of course, we don't know yet what is going to be the cost for the Iranian opening of its own missile silos in defense of the Palestinian people, essentially indirectly targeting Israel, right? This also reveals what is, what is the reality of European freedom of speech. European freedom of speech means actually basically signing into law in Germany that you have to support Israel in order to be naturalized as a German citizen. It also means illegalizing the boycott and so forth. And you have illegalizing any expression of support for the resistance movements in the UK. That is, what is freedom of speech? Freedom of speech is towing the line of opposing resistance and supporting Israel. That is what freedom of speech is from the perspective of the European ruling classes. And from the perspective of the US ruling classes, freedom of speech stops if you speak out too strongly in terms that are defended in international law and they're defended by the First Amendment. That is, according to the black letter law of international and domestic covenants and legislation, you basically can either be de facto criminalized or at least subject to extreme harassment, right? Or two, you can, for example, if you're like Mamadou Tal, you can be faced with, who's a Cornell graduate student, you can be subjected to effective deportation for exercising your freedom of speech in the US context, right? In defense of Palestine and in defense of the national liberation struggle of the Palestinian people. So that is what freedom of speech means. And that's also why there's been scores of repressive speech codes that are being signed into university code of conduct at universities across the United States. That is, so what is that? That is the university system as it's currently constituted. These are investment banks and vocational training for engineers and bankers with a sideline in liberal arts education. That is the function right now of the domestic university system in the United States, right? So again, so it's like a lightning bolt and says, okay, this is what these institutions are. I don't believe in immutability of institutions. I'm not an anarchist, and I'm not like an abolish everything. In fact, I don't really, I hate prisons, but I don't believe in abolishing anything really, except the ruling class. But, this brings into very sharp relief the nature of the world system, right? And who is supporting Palestine within the international system, even verbally, right? Petro, okay, Maduro, Cuba, Bolivia, right? These are the forces that are defending Palestine, even at the verbal stage in the world system. The Zimbabwe, to a lesser extent, the ANC, to a larger extent, the EFF in South Africa, the Communist Party of Kenya, and so forth, right? This tells us a lot about who is willing to speak out in favor of Palestine and who is not, right? And again, this is a way of bringing it. This is the world as it's currently constituted, and these are the friends and enemies of the Palestinian struggle are kind of, in many ways, the friends and enemies of the worldwide progressive movement as it currently exists. And this is what I was trying to say, right? And a lot of this was building on really the foundational insights of the PFLP and Hassan Kanafani, who were explaining this, that when you begin a struggle, you must ask, who are your friends and who are your enemies, and why is that the case, right? And they set out a series of their classical construction, the Zionism locally, the global Zionist movement, Arab reaction, and imperialism are the enemies of the Palestinian revolution, right? And then they put the very complicated Arab republics in a very different category because they were at that point offering the historical analog to the contemporary support fronts. So again, this is bringing what the world system is into view, and that's very significant. And it also brings the contemporary contours of the leftist petty bourgeoisie into view, right? And this is what I was in the U.S., right? And this is what I was talking about. You have a lot of people who you have some people who outwardly support the resistance, but then they're kind of smacked down by especially if they work in the university system. You have many more who quietly to themselves support the resistance. I know for a fact that there's a great many of them. I'll respect their privacy by not naming them, but it's the case. Right. And it's more every day, because everyone who's serious, everyone who is humane understands right now that it is not our BDS movements and it is not our capacity to offer an uncommitted vote that even has a hope of bringing an end to the genocide in Palestine and the risk of widespread evaporation of social infrastructure in Lebanon, and that risks are, that the forces capable of doing that are the forces with guns in the Arab-Iranian region. They are not in the imperial core. And if you want to condemn them because you want promotion or tenure or something, I see no other reason. I don't see any commitment other than by Zionists to condemning them. I just see it as purely a cynical and careerist maneuver. If people want to do that, they can, right? And that's who in turn they are, right? But it brings into view, I think, what is where people's commitments lie.
So let's unpack that a little bit. This kind of especially clear on the left, this surreptitious attempt that has different guises of eroding support for the axis of resistance. One of them, which is, you hinted at already, is this claim that members of the resistance, Iran especially, are not any better than the force that they're fighting, that Iran itself harbors imperialist and expansionist aspirations, or that other parts of the resistance are in fact bourgeois movements that are ultimately uninterested in the fate of the people they purport to defend. So how do we respond to that? And maybe I'll ask in particular for you to talk a bit about the way that you unpack and formulate the national question and the role of U.S. imperialism in the region, and how that necessarily transforms the way we think about the resistance, regardless of its class character, right? So what is the class-based and materialist understanding of the axis of resistance today against that kind of claim that's being put forward?
Right. So, I mean, if we go back to the late 40s through the 1980s, and especially retrospectively, the way people understand decolonization, I mean, most people understand that decolonization was historically necessary for a broader process of human emancipation. That is, achieving the political kingdom, achieving a universalizing, what Sam Moyo and Pravin John Patterson call the political sovereignty regime. That is de jure, not de facto, de jure equality within the world system, was a step towards the achievement of socialism and broader processes of national liberation, right? That you needed to have these political levers in order to reconstruct and retool your domestic social structure, right? And this could not be done under colonialism. So this is one thing, is that to bring that into view, if we translate that, not mechanically, but if we translate that with some sense of historical fluidity to our current moment, what we see is that the US imperialism is proceeding through the collapse of the regional political sovereignty regime, the reimposition of essentially de jure semi-colonial states, again, to use the terminology of Patricianos and Pravin Jha, the imposition of renewed semi-colonialism on states like Afghanistan, Iraq, in many ways, de facto Lebanon, Syria, which is occupied by US troops, right? Libya, which underwent state collapse and so forth, right? That in fact, there are literal occupations of these countries, which means the collapse of a political sovereignty regime, that this is the battlefield chosen by US imperialism. US imperialism is precisely advancing, and here just describing facts, US imperialism is objectively advancing through the collapse of the political sovereignty regime and the prevention of these countries from making use of their domestic natural and human resources for the betterment of their own populations. If this is the battlefield chosen by imperialism, the corollary is that that is a battle that those opposed to imperialism have to win. If imperialism is telling you to your face, we are choosing to subjugate you by imposing sanctions upon you and by occupying your country, then it is the most normal thing in the world that the resistance against that would take the form of anti-sanctions campaigns and the expulsion of imperialist bases and imperialist occupation forces, for example, in the northeast of Syria or throughout Iraq, from your country, right? This is so, yeah. So obviously this not only is it clear, it's just obvious that you need you need a political system that can control the dispensation of the natural resources of your country, but you actually need to expel a force which obviously is inimical to those ends, which wants to prevent your government from even potentially using those natural resources for its own sovereign development. Like, this is the most clear thing in the world, right? It's taken a great deal of hot Marxist like gesticulation and obfuscation to prevent people from understanding this very simple fact, right? To the point that it is not on the US left's agenda, right? That the US is actually in a belligerent occupation of Syria, and that the status of force agreement allows it to sustain a sustained military presence under Iraq, which was basically agreed to at the point of a gun, right? Or the US is carrying out unilateral coercive sanctions that prevent the free development of the productive forces of a great variety of countries. And the US does not even allow self-determination, which means the freedom to choose your own political representatives and political leaders of a great variety of forces in the region, right? Including especially Palestine, but also Lebanon and also Iran. Right. So this is one thing, is that if this is actually the battlefields chosen by US imperialism, then it's natural that these are the battlefields you have to fight on, which doesn't mean they're the only battlefields available. That is, you need to deal with these processes that constrain the development of your own productive forces. It doesn't matter if your own political regime it lacks sufficient clarity, right? The same way that people were, for the most, not people, but it's now retrospectively understood that it was good to support the anti-colonial forces, right? At the time, of course, it was very contentious. Precisely that contention is, in fact, the class interest of European colonialism passed through a glass darkly and transformed into this kind of quavering and worry about whether or not these forces were capable of acting without the appropriate tutelage of the Euro-American left, right? And that was the kind of line about from those forces who withheld their support for anti-colonialism during the anti-colonial struggles. And it's the same thing today, right? There's actually, functionally, there's no difference whatsoever, either in terms of the paternalism, the chauvinism, the racism, and the soft pleading for imperialism itself. And of course, the class position of alignment with the US imperial class interest that subtends all of these kind of chauvinist imaginaries, right? So that's one point that's very important. Another point is, of course, that here I have I've just been talking about facts, but what is the accumulation strategy? The accumulation strategy, of course, is the same as it ever was. That is to repress the combativity of labor on a world scale, to repress the labor share of value on a world scale, which translates, of course, into lower prices for wages in the third world the third world on the whole. And then you do that by hammering the Arab region into the ground and ensuring that the petrodollars, right, historically went basically directly into U.S. accounts, also through the system of arms dollar, petrodollar recycling, also through the purchase of U.S. treasuries. Now it's much more through sovereign wealth funds, which are then recycled back, also through the role of the petrodollars in actually sustaining black ops, for example, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Sustained black ops, not only, of course, in Syria and Iraq through Daesh, which the U.S. approves of heartily and thoroughly, but also, of course, you can be sure that these forces are spreading right-wing propaganda, not only in the Arab region, the whole, but anywhere where there are revanchist Sunni forces. The forces that are spreading that is, of course, the Arab Gulf states, right? They are spreading anti-systemic, that is pro-systemic, revanchist propaganda that and reactionary propaganda that actually confuses and diffuses class consciousness amongst various forces. And also, of course, they are. We will be sure to discover in the archives in 50 years that they were very active in all forms of like para-ISIS type movements in, for example, the Sahel and for that matter in Pakistan, right? And actually we know Pakistan historically, right, that Pakistan secret services were behind the rise of the anti-Soviet forces, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, for example, right? So this is kind of the agenda, is to repress the combativity of labor, to ensure that the share of resources flows to the north, and in this way to kind of prevent any threat to the purchasing power both of northern wages, but also the share of profit flowing to northern capital, right? And so, and of course, this relies circularly on a militarization of the world system. And this, of course, is meant essentially to encircle China and Russia at a certain level, right? And so the Arab region is really central to that for all of these reasons, right? I mean, there's more specific reasons we can think about the specific roles that the Arab region plays in the current moment. For example, that all of North Africa both is a region of export-oriented industrialization, cheap agricultural products for Europe, and also maybe most centrally, it's a source of brain drain. That is the social labor of the Arab peoples of North Africa, which are major population centers, right? We're talking about something over 200 million people. The social labor crystallized in skilled labor and also unskilled labor is then exported to either occupy low-skilled tasks in across Europe or occupy high-skilled tasks for which the European capital doesn't have to pay the cost of their production, right? And so you have the brain drain of doctors, engineers, accountants from the whole of North Africa to Europe is actually astounding, right? It's actually a subsidy to the European capital, and is a way that the European working class is actually able to benefit also, right? Never mind, that Germany historically, going back to the 1960s, was a major capitalist investor, for example, in Tunisia, which no one talks about, is actually heavily involved in counterinsurgency operations in contemporary Tunisia, right? So, people close their eyes to all of this and then cast this as, well, Israel is just global racism. And it's like, yeah, that's where we start. Okay, what does that mean, global racism? But if you just want to talk about it in these fluffy, abstract seminar term rooms that kind of make you feel good and like you're participating in a DEI initiative in the United States liberal arts campus, you're not going to understand the system, but you're also going to be more or less find your place in it. Now, this is very much obfuscated. People talk about, for example, Iran being that it's repressive domestically. Well, every state is repressive domestically, first of all. Second of all, if you think that Iran's social contradictions are a basis for the infringement on its sovereignty through the imposition of sanctions, you are actually recapitulating the civilizing mission. You are saying you have the right to abrogate its political sovereignty and its free play of the development of its productive forces because they haven't reached an adequate level of civilization that you find adequate. right? And then this is justified in a kind of Marxist lingo through saying Iran is sub-imperialist or imperialist. Now, I've read all of this work. There's not a single attempt to offer a rigorous justification. Who wrote this? Negri, Peter Hallward, very important philosophers. That Peter Hallward was has been an interpreter of Badiou and signs his name to something that claims that Iran is engaged in sub-imperialism by arming the Lebanese, Palestinian, and Yemeni resistance, right? This is an insult to thought, and it's also very ludicrous, right? What do you accept? Would he accept? Would Peter Hallward accept? And, people think it's actually very crude in the academy to name names, right? People are like, it's very uncollegial that you name that Peter Hallward, who's a very sweetheart and made a mistake signing his name to this petition that demonized the Iranian arming of Palestinian ghetto dwellers. And I'm like, well, he could just apologize. I would lift up his apology to the sky and tweet it to everybody I know, right? I'd be like, this guy, it offered a mea culpa. Nobody in the Western left does that. This guy is amazing, right? This is a diversion from our discussion, but I think it's very indicative of actually the kind of political culture that prevails in the left that reinforces this pattern of complicity with the systemic racism. But no one offered has offered. I mean, I've yet to see it. I wrote about this, about the argument about Iranian imperialism. Basically, I had to be Googling things to come up with what could they mean, right? I'm going to go and see what Marini said, because they never cite Marini. I don't even think the concept of sub-imperialism is that useful. They don't cite Marini, who coined the concept of sub-imperialism. They just say it's sub-imperialism, by which they mean state that's not that powerful, but kind of powerful, doing thing in other state or region. That's literally what they mean. And I'm like, this is intellectually laughable. And the idea that people who are at the very peak of, of course, we're talking about the peak of a swamp of Western Marxist thought, are engaged in this form of kind of basically name calling, right? What's to take seriously? You haven't offered any argument. All you've done is to translate the idea of Iran being a nefarious, reactionary, fundamentalist, authoritarian, sectarian force, which is actually the argument of the Western think tanks and Zionists. And you've said, well, actually it's those things, but it's sub-imperialist and therefore against the working class. That's all you've done, right? That's all you've accomplished. That's all you've accomplished in terms of your level of argumentation. So what is to take seriously? What is to consider as a collegial argument of people who are kind of misguided or just incorrect? And it's okay to be incorrect. Half of what I say probably incorrect too. Where's the argument that people are making that we are enjoined to take seriously? It doesn't exist. So what do you conclude about those individuals? Are they just sheep who are like lambs, in fact, who are crossing the street and they didn't know better because they have lamb brains and they got lost and they just need to be guided back? Or are they actually agents of their own decisions and therefore and engaged in a process that an intellectual process that lubricates regime change?
Well, you have a very similar tendency in the theoretical works that have been put out on Russia, right? On one end of the spectrum, you have just absolute theoretical illiteracy. You have people who will say, well, obviously, an act of military aggression is imperialist, therefore Russia's imperialist. But then you'll have these arguments that have clearly done their theoretical homework, which will say, well, Russia's motivations for invasion clearly can't be situated within the realm of, economics, economic expansion, the expansion of monopoly capital, and so on. Therefore, we need to revisit Lenin's theory of imperialism and try to define a new theory that fits the current, conjuncture. So you have this, very surreptitious attempt to undermine the theoretical basis of the left, and this comes from circles that self-identify as Marxist. But coming back to Palestine, maybe I want to talk a little bit about two other tendencies, which I think are also important to unpack. One comes largely from parts of the left, which I think maybe is gripped by a certain kind of romanticism or idealism that claims, without disparaging the axis of resistance directly, claims that it's not doing enough, claims that the axis of resistance could be doing a lot more to help the Palestinian people. And it strikes me that's a sneaky way, a sneaky attempt to reorient the geography of struggle away from its vanguard, away from the regional anti-hegemonic forces, towards either the authors of the violence, right? So the parliamentarians in the US and Europe and elsewhere, who are actively sending weapons to Israel, or to states that have much less capacity to stop it and to intervene. So that's one kind of argument that you hear a lot. And the other, of course, is the one that presents the United States as a kind of passive, impotent observer of the carnage, right? Biden has set red line after red line. Netanyahu's uncontrollable. The Zionist lobby in the US effectively determines, the outcome of political processes. And again, you have on one hand this attempt to reorient solidarities away from the regional resistance, and on the other, this attempt to exonerate imperialism and to dampen anti-imperialist sentiments within the rising movement, right? Precisely at the moment that has summoned anti-imperialist sentiments in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime, probably. So, can you talk a little bit about maybe both of those, but specifically the role of the Zionist lobby as an argument that's deployed to exonerate the U.S. from its role in the genocide and in the wider occupation?
Sure. So, I think there are two distinct dispositions when it comes to people who are discussing the Israel lobby, right? And I should say overestimating its role. Some people are, I think, legitimately confused and also understandably don't see a proper theorization, a proper analysis of the role of the Israel lobby within the world system, within U.S. foreign policy, within U.S. domestic manufacturing of consent and so forth. And they're like, okay, well, are these people just like, we see a lobby in front of us. We see AIPAC specifically targeting Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. We see the ADL specifically demonizing Black radicals. We see Zionists specifically targeting Black radicals. We see the Schusterman Foundation specific, and the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which is a creature of the Zionists. We see them specifically engage in a process of spreading Zionist and imperialist propaganda, and you're telling me there's no Israel lobby, right? I think this is one set of people. I believe both they're responding to a lack of a clear enough analysis, and also they're like, okay, the people who say that, I want to have a discussion with them, because I'm like, no, there is an Israel lobby, and like, in fact, we've like written about it a lot, right? Then there's another set of people who think fundamentally that the Biden, like Daniel Denver of the Dig, he recently pontificated that the Netanyahu's dragging the U.S. into war. And Daniel was like very involved in like the anti-committed movement. They're basically probably going to vote for the Democrats. They, work for Jacobin, which is basically a soft support structure for the Democratic Party, right? This is a containment operation, right? I don't know whether such an individual knows better or not. I don't know what a question like that would mean, but I know what they're doing and what they're saying and why it's wrong. Right? It's wrong. I mean, it's not just that it absolves the U.S., it actually falsifies history, right? I mean, what is the U.S. imperial interest in the Arab region? I mean, I discussed it before, right? The U.S. wants neo-colonial control along with the collapse of populations. It doesn't want a nonviolent outcome in the Arab region. I mean, maybe optimally, the U.S. would like it if it could manage neo-colonialism, including in Palestine, without incurring violent resistance, right? If you could have mini-me's, doppelgangers of the Palestinian Authority carrying out security cooperation with Israel and the US in every country in the Arab-Iranian region, sure, that could arguably, just arguably, be beneficial. right? But first of all, I mean, this totally neglects the importance of the arms industry as a conduit of U.S. expansion. But second of all, it actually erases the idea that populations will resist colonial and neo-colonial structures, right? The resistance to colonial and neo-colonial structures is not because Israel is doing it, right? That's part of it. But actually, the resistance is because people's lives are being shattered, because that's built into imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism writ large. People are going to resist it in Egypt. People are going to resist it in Jordan. And people are going to resist it everywhere because their lives are destroyed. And it's not like the US would have an interest in not destroying lives if it were not for the presence of Israel. So Israel, therefore, represents one amongst theoretical strategies for accumulation. But because of the course of history, this is the one that the US inherited from the colonial powers of sponsorships of the UK, France, and the collusion of the Zionist movement, which itself represented kind of an export and class alliance of domestic class contradictions in Europe, and also represented a selling of one way of resolving those contradictions onto the back of the Palestinian people with the support of European capital, and European, we should say specifically Jewish and then Zionist capital, going back to the early 1900s or late 1880s, right? Now, this is history as it is. These are the social forces that emerged by the late 1960s as a way of managing Arab nationalism, right? And you always had this tendency in the State Department that was like, well, we can keep Nasser under control, right? And the French were like, no, you can't, right? The French were like, we need to go to war. I mean, Nasser is actually a major support structure for the Algerian Revolution. Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, right? And that's why we're going to launch the tripartite aggression. Meanwhile, there are doves, so-called, or Arabists in the Kennedy administration who are like, no, we can deal with Nasser. We can deal with Nasser. They got outvoted eventually. Why? Because people understood that you could not contain radical republicanism in the Arab region, right? It was going to keep radicalizing because this was the crystallization representative of a broader liberatory impulse. This was the social form it took, right? And it was likewise in all the other states of the Arab region. So these people are basically imagining, underlying this is a very conservative, underlying this kind of lobbyist diverting U.S. foreign policy is a very idealistic and really romanticized and also paternalistic understanding that basically the Arab region could actually be modernized in a peaceful, non-conflictual way, right? Which is a ridiculous thing for Marxists to be embracing, right? This is an absurd hypothesis. There's no connection to reality, right? But they're kind of imagining this kind of stylized modernization sequence where like a middle class leads to kind of a peaceful developmental sequence, right? Second of all, I mean, they're like, then the Arab region could just partake in world trade and industry. Does the world need more industry? Like, do these people read the other literature? Their other kind of bobblehead dolls are circulating. There's like a surplus. There's a lot of industrialization in the world system. It's not being used at capacity. You want to bring online more industrialization? Do you want to increase the size of markets in the Arab region through how? Raising wages? Does capital want to raise wages in the Arab region? Does capital want to raise wages anywhere, right? In terms of some kind of like new Keynesian domestic pact driven by demand-induced industrialization, right? Like I run through these things. Some of them are run through in the article. Some of them are just kind of popped into my head because they're very ludicrous, right? They're just not how capitalism is working. But these are the kind of underlying assumptions that one has to kind of stipulate, or at least, but never articulate, through this idea that Israel is kind of dragging the U.S. into war. Never mind that you actually need war in order to disturb and quell the combativity of labor. You need violence, you need fascism in order to repress peripheral populations. And especially you need this violence to keep the arms industry going. And the arms industry is a kind of a central pole of U.S. accumulation. It's also where a lot of the military Keynesianism hides. It's also where, and circularly, it's used to arm the actual processes of counterinsurgency on a world scale. So this is a fantasy world of U.S. accumulation, which is not the actual world of U.S. accumulation. And if you do a kind of a political sociology of the people selling it, they're social democrats for the most part, right on the left. Overall, these are social democrats, right? So of course they want to imagine that US imperialism is not culpable, because essentially their entire theoretical apparatus and also their political and social habitus is oriented around not opposing imperialism. So perforce, they're going to have a theory of US foreign policy and US activity in the Arab-Iranian region that says the Israel lobby is leading the US astray. Right. And I just want to bring as a last point in conclusion, like there is an Israel lobby, right? I mean, AIPAC is actually a way that and is mostly funded by Zionist wealth and is used as an attack dog against people who are shifting the discourse one step to the left. It actually functions to keep the Democratic Party in line. But the rest of the US ruling class also wants to keep the Democratic Party bases in line and avoid any sort of leftward shift. So there's a service being done. Whether that service has an aspect of excess, it could, but most, imperialism and capitalism is a vector for interests. Those interests have an element of antagonism and a larger element of cooperation. And certain things, the same way people used to talk about Ford or the US auto industry kind of suffers a little bit in terms of its competitiveness from not being able to offer the subsidy of free government subsidized healthcare to its workers. Okay, but these are also quid pro quo. It doesn't really want. It also won't ally with anyone trying to essentially expropriate the U.S. healthcare industry. Right. So this is the way capitalism works. There's people with mild antagonisms within a broader framework of overall convergence in terms of their overall support for the architecture of class cooperation and common class interest on a world scale. Particularly, I think the Zionist lobby plays a very powerful role in forging dissent, quashing Islam, quashing the combativity of Islamic, of Muslim social sectors and so forth. But I think it's carrying out this role basically on behalf of the ruling class as a whole. But it's definitely the Israel lobby doing it, and it should be named, right? The role of the ADL should be named. Campus Hillels, in terms of aggressively being the forefront of opposition to anti-Zionism on campuses, that can be named. AIPAC in its role, that could be named, and there should be campaigns to combat it, right? It's very clear. Now, it doesn't mean that one should follow from that they're drawing U.S. foreign policy astray. This is a nationalist fairy tale.
Yeah. It's interesting, you're talking about the social democratic tendency to assume the possibility of a peaceful bourgeois path of development for the Arab world. And it seems to me that a corollary of that is the denial of the role of the Soviet Union in the region during the Cold War, because the Soviet Union, of course, was not only a bloc on monopoly accumulation by the West, it was also, if not the engine, then a massive source of support for national liberation struggles. It's an arms to various forces. It entered into trade relationships with many post-colonial states on terms much more favorable than anything that was on offer from the imperialist states. So it acted as a kind of a force for redistributive tendency, for tendencies that supported agrarian reform and for forces that sought agrarian reform. And then the collapse, of course, of the Soviet Union, the defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, reversed a lot of that and basically killed off a lot of those forces. And I wonder if maybe we could talk very briefly about what the disappearance of the USSR as a counterweight to monopoly capital meant for the struggle in the region, but specifically for the struggle in Palestine. Because I think it's important to reclaim that history too.
Sure. So, in fact, my academic research is actually the intellectual history of how people conceived of development in Tunisia, but I also look at it in Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Palestine, to some extent, Lebanon, and so forth, right? Because I was very interested in understanding how did development become normative in the Arab-Iranian region, right? How did it come to be assumed that you needed to do development? And how did specific understandings of development become normative? That is, development is a big word, and it covers a lot of planning options. So how does a specific understanding become normative? That is, how does a more redistributive understanding of development become normative versus a less redistributive understanding of development, right? How does this happen? Right? How does it come to be common sense? How does it come to be common sense for people to say, we need to do an agrarian reform, right? You can't just say it's poverty, right? Because that would be very mechanical. You can't just say agrarian inequality produces the normative consensus around agrarian reform. It's not just land inequality, because there's land inequality now, but no one's discussing agrarian reform, right? It has to translate somehow through a series of pressures into an ideological consensus around a set of redistributive policies that then are or not operationalized and implemented, depending on the balance of social forces on a world scale, including the threat of repression, right? And so this is really where, in fact, I'm a lot less familiar with the aid policies and so forth, probably because I focus most of my empirical research on Tunisia. But I'm familiar. There were lots of delegations: China, Egypt, Yemen, sending delegations to Maoist China. There were bilateral linkages between the National Institute of Planning in Egypt under Sadat and the Eastern Bloc, less so with the USSR, probably because of Egyptian non-alignment. And so, all of these things meant that it became normative. Not only it became normative for there to be a process of development, and also, people within parties like the PFLP could go to Russia to go get their advanced training. They could also go to Baghdad, by the way, or Damascus, but they could also go to Russia to get Soviet Union to get engineering training and so forth, right? And that's why you actually have a certain generation of Palestinians. You're like, oh, you're half Yugoslavian, or you're half Russian, and their dad speaks Russian or Yugoslavian or something, because they went and grew up there and studied there, right? And it's interesting to see. But this is a reflection of the power of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, people were first, it was double blow, right? First, Soviet Union fell. Then Iraq basically fell under sanctions, right? It was completely leveled. I mean, Iraq was a dictatorship. Iraq, and some of my friends are going to kill me for this, supported the aggression against Iran to put a stop to the revolution there, with the U.S. Backing it. But Iraq was repressing dissidents. Iraq had an incredibly developed welfare state, even amidst war with Iran through the late 1980s, right? And they were carrying out all forms of state planning. They had massive state health infrastructure. They had aspects of industrialization. They had agrarian planning, right? They had healthcare systems, they had universities, right? At a very high development level. That was destroyed right after the fall of the USSR, with that the US just would not have done that to Iraq if the USSR was in place. We can't rerun history, but that very much appears to be the case, right? And with both Iraq gone and the USSR gone, or mostly gone, and the USSR gone, right? Then they imposed surrender terms on the Palestinians, whereas the South Africans were able to crystallize their anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, it's not the same, but they were able to crystallize their anti-apartheid struggle in the end of apartheid, and do a little bit better, because the timing was a little bit better, in part at least, right? The Palestinians were not able to do that, and that's why they had no option. There was nowhere to turn. There was no other bloc saying, "We'll support you with this. We'll support you to maintain your resistance." No, they were basically forced to the negotiating table by the U.S. and the Gulf states, and probably through a lot of threats of financial blackmail, right? Because the Gulf states were supporting the PLO, right? So the fall of it also meant that the PFLP was just devastated, right? I mean, it could no longer receive any help from the USSR. The terror lists cut off sources of capital supply from the US. I mean, the terror lists, again, were part of the globalization project, which itself was a function of the fall of the USSR, right? Again, we cannot rerun history. If the USSR hadn't fallen, the US would not have been able to impose these terror lists because, for one thing, there was a nuclear backstop with a huge amount of natural resources and its own sources of capital. The US would have never been able to impose these terror lists, right? So, I think the fall just destroyed what was left of Arab communism for the most part, left it basically a relic, and opened the way for other forms of resistance.
Let's talk about the terror lists briefly. And by the way, do you have like another 15 minutes or so?
Yeah.
Do you have to run? Okay. So let's talk about these terror lists briefly. It seems to me that this notion of terrorism is a kind of legal bureaucratic incarnation of a very old idea, which is this idea of civilization versus barbarism. The terrorist is our era's barbarian. And you cite Theodor Herzl in your piece, the founding father of Zionism, who promised that the Zionist state would act as a bulwark protecting Europe from Asia. This is the same language that Hitler used, promising that Germany would be a bulwark of the West against the Bolshevik hordes. This is, in a sense, the same language that we see from NATO, promising to be a bulwark of European democratic civilization against Russian or Russia's Asiatic barbarism, as it's sometimes termed. So, what's the function of this colonial language in delegitimizing the regional resistance and building, support for the colonial project?
The rhetoric is just it's a continual resuscitation of these very racist and Islamophobic tropes, and they kind of they rely, first of all, and this is never discussed, they rely first on this reduction of the Arab region to Islam, right? This has long been a kind of component of imperialist ideology over the last 50 years, but it's kind of inverted and accepted often in the West, where people actually talk about the Muslim ban. And I always thought this was a terrible decision to call it a Muslim ban. It's not a Muslim ban. It targeted certain countries. It targeted countries which have Christian populations, right? And it didn't include Saudi Arabia. So why is it a Muslim ban? Which not all Muslims are being banned. So why is it then a Muslim ban, right? Because that was a way of depoliticizing it, right? In fact, and preventing it from being linked to the legacy of a cross-sect Arab republicanism, right? And also the political aspect of cross-sect resistance, right? I mean, it's notable, I think still the PFLP has a disproportionate number of Christians, for example, right? And is aggressively, it's not terror listed because of a bleed over of Islamophobia. It's terror listed because it's a resistance force to Israeli colonialism, right? So I think this is super important to keep in mind. What these lists do, these lists aren't really about blocking people from sending money to the PFLP, right? I don't believe that's the case. I think they're about preventing any linkage between the exile communities in the most powerful and richest state in the world, between exile communities and their homelands, right? Because people could really be an active support base for the national struggle in a much more profound way if they were not terrified of being associated with these groups and at risk of lifelong imprisonment if there was material support found, right? So this is really about political quarantine. I don't think it's about economic and financial quarantine. I think it's a part of it, yeah. But I think it's very significantly around political quarantine and to accelerate demonization campaigns. It makes people scared to say, I support this resistance force, right? It makes people really scared, and their fear is legitimate. It's not an illegitimate fear, but resisting fear is a collective project too, right? It's not something, one doesn't resist fear as an individual, and resists fear as part of a collective. So it's not, the point is not to moralize about people's being scared. It's okay to be scared, actually. But the point is that these terror lists were really about a political quarantine operation that's meant to create these separations between the U.S. and the zone of storms and alienate people from the national liberation projects on a world scale. I mean, I think that is the central goal, and that is, they continuously are trying to, for example, pin material support on all sorts of Arab and Muslim groups in the U.S. They're still trying to do it. These groups are not engaged in material support. They're just not, right? Why? Because that would be crazy. They're not sending money to illegal forces knowing that they would be sent to jail for the rest of their life. They're not flouting these material support legislations. So what is happening is that it's being used to create an encompassing atmosphere of fear in the face of the U.S. kind of ideological and moral counterinsurgency against these people that actually prevents a coherent bloc, which would in turn of support for these guerrilla groups at the ideological and moral level, which would in fact better resist the demonization campaigns and allow for a more robust and might eventually allow for the lifting of these terror lists. How are people going to agitate to resist the terror lists if they don't want anything to do with the groups that are on the terror lists and maybe believe that these are agents of wide-scale massacre? It's not going to happen, right? So this is kind of where we are, and this is why people need to keep that in mind and eventually mount campaigns. And I think we see important shifts. For example, Palestine Legal. I think it was the Diala Shamas, Daroli, Dylan Saba, actually began to wrote recently about the terrorists. Historically, Palestine Legal did not want to go into that. They wrote a great report that also discussed the terrorists, right? This is a precursor to resisting the terrorists. So that's what has to be done.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it seems to me that in a way, that campaign of relegating the act of resistance to this realm of terrorism, this criminal category, has has genuinely pulled a lot of people away from support towards these armed anti-colonial forces. And indeed, even within Palestine, I was there in May last year. Many people I met could not see a role for armed struggle in the liberation of Palestine. They said, we're facing a technologically superior enemy. They are so well armed. The instruments of surveillance are so refined that there is nothing that can be done through, there's no possibility of winning on the terrain of armed resistance. And pretty much universally among the people I know, there's been a very palpable shift over the past 12 months since the 7th of October in recognizing the seismic importance of the armed resistance in the region. And I want to talk a little bit about that, since today is the anniversary of October 7th. What's the significance of Hamas's operation?
I mean, first of all, we can say two central things. One, Hamas repoliticized, reactivated, re-energized on a global scale the Palestinian cause, right? I mean, across the Arab region, you had creeping normalization, right? It was creeping normalization in Saudi Arabia through the Abraham Accords, but it was also creeping normalization in Tunisia, right? Which, where at the popular level, there's widespread support for Palestine, and there's widespread support for the armed resistance in Tunisia at the popular level, and they don't recognize Israel. Yet there was still creeping economic and cultural normalization, right? That is a dead letter, right? In the first case. So the process of normalization within the Arab region is shattered, right? This is one thing. Another thing is that globally, Palestine has exposed all these contradictions, and this is not something that can be put back in the bottle. Third, I think it forced people to really think about the world in a powerful way. I mean, I think it really forced people to understand that, the U.S. is a death machine, right? If I said that 2 years ago, people think, oh, you're being polemic. Shouldn't you be speaking more politely? You're an academic. Put that in you're supposed to be sophisticated. Now, say the U.S. is a death machine. People are like, yes, the U.S. is a death machine. People are going to be mobilized to resist the U.S. in the U.S. if they understand what its nature is in a deeper level. And I think this is very significant. And this is something Palestinian resistance achieved, right? And I also think there's been a wide-scale radicalization within the region. I mean, I think within Yemen especially, right? People are understanding more about the nature of the world system and what it will take to change it. And I think these are very significant shifts within our world.
Max, before we wrap up, one final question, not about Palestine, but one I think that is worth asking all of our interviewees, all of our speakers, is how did you come to be a communist?
Well, my parents were active in the student movement in the United States in the 60s and 70s. So and my mom was in a Marxist-Leninist group. So although they didn't kind of feed Marxist-Leninism to me at all, I understood that I was a leftist growing up. Like that was like very clear to me. I think I got interested, really understood myself as a Marxist, that is, as a communist, much more through understanding that there was no other analytical tool but Marxism that would help me understand the US role in the Arab region, right? It was like a puzzle, a desperate political puzzle. I needed to understand it. And I said, okay, the only people giving coherent explanations are the Marxists. No one else is, right? This really helped me. And then I think it crystallized even more just living in Tunisia and kind of living in the mental world of Tunisian Marxists also pushed me along.
Max Ajl, thank you so much for joining us for this inaugural episode. It was great to have you on. I'm sure we'll speak again many more times in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Great.
All right, I'm not going to stop the recording because I have a little bit to record after we end. But yeah, thanks so much. This was great. This was really useful, and I think I'm glad we did it today. This is going to be out, I think, in 2 days. They're going to need a bit of time to edit it. There's some PR agency in Pakistan that Amar got to help us with this. So
okay, great. I hope I help support your line struggle and PI with.
Yes. I mean, this is part of the agenda for sure.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And
I gotta get.
You can join the call tomorrow, right?
Yeah. What time is it?
It's 3 p.m. UTC, which is, I think, in 30 minutes from now, whatever time that is for you.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'll do it.
Great. And I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day, and thanks for making the time again.
For sure, man. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Sorry, am I still uploading though?
No, you can, I don't know, what does it say? I think you can just leave the studio and it will, wait, let me see what happens.
Oh, it's giving me an uploading recordings.
Do you have to stay on while it does that? Let me see if I can end the recording.